Along with cold temperatures and more than a foot of snow, we recently got a dramatic lesson about climate change on the streets of Boston. In this case, it was flooding caused by record tide levels, especially in areas such as the Seaport District, Fort Point, East Boston, and Dorchester. But the flooding also reflects predictions by the city, and it follows response measures already put in place. To bring us up to date is the mayor's chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, Austin Blackmon. Thank you very much for being with us, Austin.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, in addition to there just being a lot of water on the streets, what actually happened last week? I mean, every so often you have a high tide, so what's the problem here?
Well, this storm brought with it quite a bit of storm surge, and that also coincided with one of the higher high tides that we see throughout the year. And as a result, those coming together, we actually experienced what was either very close to or exceeded a 100-year flooding event in the city of Boston.
Well, we'll put this into some context. Is this just something like a 100-year flood, or are we seeing something more disturbing recently, and do you see more down the line in the near term?
Well, as we've done in our predictions through Climate Ready Boston, we expect more severe weather to impact Boston and the East Coast in general. But that said, we'll take this storm into account and measure it against all the other changes that we're seeing throughout the nation to see if this really is a trend. But I think if you look at the impacts that Houston's gone through, that Florida's gone through, that Puerto Rico's gone through very recently, it's hard to say that this isn't more of a disturbing trend.
Well, talk about how disturbing this actually was, because we saw some of the video that were posted by different people, and you see this dumpster, floating down a main street on the Seaport District. I mean, that looks pretty bad.
Well, of course, and it's shocking to see things like that happen, but when you work on these things on a daily basis like I do and the team at the City Hall does, it's something that we don't find super surprising. So we were able to get a forecast in very early on Thursday morning and get that information out to all of our first responders so that they could adjust their operational plans to deal with the response to the storm. And that's something that we're going to have to learn from. It's one thing to have been able to predict and forecast that we were going to have this flooding event, but now we'll understand whether we'll have some areas that we didn't project to have flooding that we need to adjust our plans for. And so it'll be an iterative process to help the city of Boston become more resilient.
Well, one thing that was a little surprising to me was going down to Seaport District the morning after and seeing that, where was the flood? I saw just practically no trace of this whatsoever. Why is that?
We were fortunate. The storm and the high tide peaked and receded pretty quickly. If it had stayed longer and had the opportunity to freeze up and maybe clog some of our catch basins or drains, this could have been a much more damaging event. Obviously, lots of folks still had challenges, people reporting flooding in their buildings, and we'd had inspectional services and their building staff going and making sure that buildings were okay to reoccupy and that there weren't any impacts to electrical systems. But this was fortunate in that sense that it could have been much worse. And we should also be really fortunate that many of our infrastructure partners, including our great partners at the state, were monitoring this information as well. Mass DOT and the MBTEA, their general manager, announced that despite the impacts that happened at the aquarium station, that was because they took steps to make that station more resilient. The flooding there could have been much worse, and the Blue Line could have been impacted for much longer.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Austin Blackmon, the mayor's chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space. So, Austin, what about some of the other areas they had? I mean, Dorchester, around the Port Norfolk area, East Boston. Talk about what's going on there.
Yeah, Morrissey Boulevard is another area that was certainly impacted. But then in East Boston, another area that's in the FEMA floodplain, and an area where Mayor Walsh has directed us to do studies on what we can do to protect that neighborhood, and has also made a commitment to put in infrastructure to help protect it as well. We saw some flooding on Bremen Street, close to the East Boston Greenway also. So these are all areas that we were expecting to be in that FEMA floodplain and were ultimately impacted.
We'll talk about what you have planned in East Boston, at least, to cope with floods in the future.
Right. So the East Boston Greenway is a great example. It's an area that we expect to be challenged as a result of climate change and sea level rise. And Mayor Walsh made an announcement that there will be putting in a temporary flood barrier that can be deployed when we're expecting storms like this one. And as a result, instead of floodwaters reaching all the way from the entrance of the Greenway down past the airport and some of the other neighborhoods, we'll be able to protect several hundred of our residents in the East Boston neighborhood. We'll also be elevating a portion of Main Street in Charlestown. So this was right next to the Ryan Playground and the Schrafft's building in Sullivan Square, as part of a broader effort to really revitalize that whole area. And we'll be raising that street up a handful of feet, and that blocks another flood entry pathway that actually impacts not only Sullivan Square, but all the way over to the Cambridge line in Charlestown.
What about for the longer term? I mean, what is the forecast? Because these seem to be small things, but what do you see maybe a few decades down the line here?
Well, we would expect to have storms of this intensity and this level of impact more frequently. And of course, as sea levels rise, then as what the 100-year storm becomes in 2050 or 2070, instead of it being a relatively small area right now, it would have much more impact. Potentially, if we were to do nothing, having flood impacts on over 70% of the South End, for instance. So this is something that Mayor Walsh and the administration are taking very seriously as we incorporate this into our citywide master plan and our forecast of what that means for the growth of the city, what it means for housing, what it means for transportation, and how we can make all of these systems more resilient.
Now, I know this might be well beyond the current administration, but this idea of building a great wall in Boston Harbor, I know there are some cities in Europe that have done something like this. Is this something that Boston will have to look at seriously?
Already have started to. So UMass Boston is leading a study right now on what a harbor-wide solution would look like. And one of the things that we're looking at as part of that study is not only what are the resiliency benefits that would provide, but what would the impacts be. So as you can imagine, putting up a big wall around Boston Harbor, that would create some challenges for access for the marine economy, which is something that's incredibly important to Boston and our history here. And if we were to do that, how could you design it in such a way that that marine traffic could continue to function? It also would mean potential ecological impacts on Boston Harbor as well. You can imagine all of that tidal action that flushes in and out of the harbor is very, very important to the harbor that we've literally spent billions of dollars cleaning up, and putting in barriers would really potentially detract from all of that.
Well, of course, this has to have an effect on development, and I guess even in the Seaport District, where they're exposed to this, I mean, they must have known this would be coming. They maybe designed things to be resilient. Did that happen in this case?
Yeah, we've gotten some reports of buildings, particularly the newer developments, that had to go through the climate preparedness checklist, which is a policy of the city that as new developments or major renovations take place, the developer has to come in and tell the city how they're taking into account risk of climate change. Just over the past year, we've actually updated those guidelines to ensure that as these developments are going in, that they have to take into account how they'll deal with climate change over the lifetime of the building, not just the current risk for it. And as a result, we've seen some of these developments, like the WS development, be able to get back online relatively quickly.
Well, of course, what's happening with the waters of Boston Harbor, it's a global phenomenon. It's driven by hydrocarbons from all over the planet. So why are steps to reduce that in the city, those hydrocarbon emissions? Why are they so important if the whole planet's causing the problem?
Well, that's a great point. But if you look at our projections for sea level rise, they really are driven by those global emissions. But that means that it's not only important what we do to reduce emissions, but it's important that we get others to follow behind us, because as we get them to take action on that, a portion of those benefits accrue to us as one of the top 5 most vulnerable cities in the U.S. to the impacts of climate change. So it's not only important that we do our part from a leadership perspective, but if we can get other cities, other nations, and other states to follow our lead and take action, then it actually benefits us as well.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Chief Austin Blackmon.